The moment I discovered Charles was having an affair, I didn't weep or rage. I simply packed our bags and left, taking our twin daughters with me. It was in that instant, as I was making that decisive exit, that a profound realization settled upon me. I hadn't truly loved Charles for a long time. His infidelity wasn't a wound, but a key, an excuse, perhaps even a liberation, to unlock a door I'd been hesitant to open. The revelation of Charles's affair was accidental, a twist of fate. He'd left a file at home that morning, and I offered to deliver it to his office. While there, on his otherwise meticulously organized desk, my eyes snagged on something utterly out of place, a Starbucks milk carton cup. It was petite, almost dainty, with an opening no larger than a coin, clearly designed for a straw. It was undeniably stylish, a sleek, minimalist design in muted tones, the kind that graced magazine spreads and whispered of understated chic. Yet, it was utterly unlike anything Charles would ever choose for himself. The Charles the First knew was a man who drank water by the gulp, straight from a glass, practicality over presentation every time. But there he was, in his crisp white shirt and tailored trousers, sipping delicately from this whimsical little cup, a straw protruding from his lips. A wave of something akin to revulsion washed over me. He noticed my gaze fixed on the cup. "My old mug broke," he explained, a touch too casually. "So I just grabbed this one from the Starbucks downstairs." He was lying. My dear friend Daphne was a connoisseur of Starbucks cups, a collector with an almost encyclopedic knowledge of their limited editions and regional releases. Just days before, she'd been lamenting the impracticality of this particular design, declaring it practically made for toddlers. And, crucially, she'd mentioned it was exclusive to Taiwan. Impossible, then, that Charles had simply grabbed one downstairs. I stared at him, his smile unwavering, his eyes meeting mine with practiced ease. When had Charles become so adept at looking me in the eye and uttering falsehoods without so much as a flicker of hesitation? I chose not to confront him then, simply remarking, "That cup looks like it would be a nightmare to clean." He chuckled, a light, dismissive sound. "It comes with a special brush." I managed a tight smile. A recent memory flashed in my mind. Charles, seized by a sudden burst of paternal energy, had attempted to clean our twin daughters' straw cups. The girls were 3, and it was the first time he'd ever undertaken the task. He'd only washed the cup itself, completely oblivious to the fact that the straws, the very channels through which their drinks flowed, also required cleaning. When I'd shown him the specialized straw brushes, patiently demonstrating their use, he'd sighed dramatically. "So much fuss. Thank goodness for you, Eleanor. I'm utterly hopeless with these little chores." "Hopeless," he'd said. Men's words, indeed, were treacherous things. He was clearly quite adept at navigating the intricacies of cleaning, especially when it came to a cup gifted by his paramour. I said nothing more, simply turned and left his office, the sterile air of the corporate space suddenly feeling thick and suffocating. The giver of the cup. In truth, my heart already knew. Husbands and wives, intimately close yet profoundly distant. I believed no wife was ever truly oblivious to her husband's infidelity. Subtle signs, like dust motes dancing in sunbeams, were always there. Perhaps it was the way he'd smile at his phone during dinner, a private amusement playing on his lips, and when asked, he'd dismiss it as a funny video. Or maybe it was the new hairstyle, a carefully considered change after years of the same look, meant to surprise and delight him, only for him to remain utterly oblivious. These seemingly insignificant details, accumulating like grains of sand, whispered a chilling truth. His heart was no longer fully present with me. Then comes the inevitable unraveling. You begin to meticulously dissect his digital life, navigating the labyrinth of his WeChat messages, until you stumble upon the thread with her. Shared songs, forwarded jokes, recommendations for restaurants. Mundane, innocuous, devoid of overt flirtation. Just the quiet sharing of the everyday. The very fabric of intimacy. And once, I had been the sole recipient of those shared moments. A primal instinct screams danger. You demand an explanation. But he vehemently denies it, proclaims his innocence with theatrical indignation, swearing on everything held sacred. He even turns the accusation back on you, branding you as overly sensitive, accusing you of starting trouble, lamenting his exhaustion, questioning your lack of empathy, suggesting you redirect your troublemaking energy towards childcare and household duties. Lacking concrete proof, you begin to doubt yourself. Am I being paranoid? Am I unjustly accusing him? Slowly, subtly, the questions fade. Perhaps from weariness, the sheer exhaustion of motherhood leaving you depleted, devoid of the energy for conflict. Or perhaps from fear, the chilling vulnerability of financial dependence, the terrifying unknown of life alone should your suspicions prove true. Until, like a thunderclap, the definitive proof arrives. As it did for me. In the office of the woman I suspected, I saw it, another milk carton cup, identical to Charles's. Juliana Bellwether, the Research Institute's youngest lead designer, Charles's subordinate, and, as it turned out, Charles's muse. Juliana confirmed my suspicions with a practiced air of innocent candor. Her cup, she explained, was a souvenir from a recent business trip to Taiwan. I thought they were so charming, I bought two. Gave one to Professor Charles as a little thank you. She smiled, a wide, guileless expression, her eyes meeting mine with unnerving sincerity. I returned the smile, a brittle, mirthless curve of my lips. Professor Charles told me he'd picked his up at the Starbucks downstairs. Juliana's smile fractured for a fleeting second, a hairline crack in the polished facade, before seamlessly reforming, a testament to the remarkable resilience of the human mask. Oh, perhaps he was worried about upsetting you? Juliana offered, a carefully crafted expression of concern furrowing her brow. I know since the awards ceremony you've harbored some reservations about my professional relationship with Charles. You've made it clear you'd prefer we didn't collaborate too closely. The awards ceremony. She was referring to Charles's recent National Design Award, where, in his acceptance speech, he'd effusively thanked his muse, Juliana Bellwether. His muse. Not his wife, the woman who'd built a life with him, but his young, ambitious colleague. An insult that could ignite even the most placid soul, yet Juliana managed to frame my potential anger as somehow unreasonable, a mark of my own insecurity. But strangely, the anger was absent. It had been replaced by a weary resignation. I cut through her carefully constructed narrative. You were aware I wasn't comfortable with your professional relationship with Charles. Yet, you still chose to gift him a matching cup? Was it simply to provoke me? Juliana, clearly unprepared for my directness, stammered, her carefully rehearsed lines dissolving on her tongue. No, Mrs. Sterling, you misunderstand. Professor Charles and I are strictly colleagues. Nothing more. Juliana's office was an open-plan space, the modern design doing little to afford any actual privacy. Our exchange had already drawn the attention of her neighboring colleagues. Juliana's eyes welled with manufactured tears, the picture of wounded innocence, as if I were the aggressor. I sighed, a sound of weary amusement. I never suggested your relationship was inappropriate, Miss Bellwether. Who dictates that male and female colleagues can't share similar taste in drinkware? Wouldn't you agree? Juliana blinked, speechless. She seemed utterly adrift, lost in the shifting currents of the conversation. I pressed on, my voice still calm, almost conversational. My only confusion lies with Charles's need to lie to me. This isn't about you, personally. Juliana's face flushed a furious crimson, the color creeping up her neck and into her hairline. The surrounding office hummed with hushed whispers, the silent audience to our unfolding drama. I found myself strangely empowered by mimicking Juliana's practiced deflection, the artful deployment of phrases like, I didn't, I'm not, you're misinterpreting. It seemed to be an almost foolproof strategy for maintaining a semblance of control. Just then, Charles materialized behind me, his hand clamping possessively on my arm. Eleanor, this has nothing to do with Juliana. Please, don't cause a scene. Whatever is troubling you, we can discuss it at home. Predictably, my husband, in this public arena, once again positioned himself firmly behind his muse, shielding her from any perceived discomfort. But this time, there was no surge of anger, no sharp pang of heartbreak. It was as if the other shoe had finally dropped, the inevitable conclusion to a long, drawn-out anticipation. A quiet sense of relief unfurled within me. The relief of finally relinquishing all expectations, all hope. And in that moment, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I no longer loved Charles. The realization, stark and undeniable, was more profound, more sorrowful, than the revelation of his infidelity itself. Gazing at the man I had once adored, the man for whom I would have willingly sacrificed everything, I began to ponder, with a heavy heart. When did the love die? When did it begin to fade? My infatuation with Charles had been instantaneous, a thunderbolt. It was the first day of university. I was strolling into class, arm in arm with Daphne, when I collided, quite literally, with Charles, who was hurrying out the door. My nose connected with his chin, a sharp, unexpected impact that sent stars exploding behind my eyes. I clutched my nose, gasping in pain. Daphne, ever the fierce protector, was already bristling, her voice sharp with indignation. Watch where you're going, you oaf. Are you blind? Then, a voice, low and melodious, laced with genuine concern. I'm so sorry. So sorry. Are you all right? When I finally dared to open my eyes, I found myself gazing up at a breathtakingly handsome young man, his expression etched with worry. Charles was from the South, from a region famed for its gentle landscapes and soft accents. He possessed a pair of Tao Hua Yen, peach blossom eyes, a Chinese idiom describing eyes that are almond-shaped, luminous, and profoundly captivating. Looking into those eyes, I understood, with an almost visceral certainty, the meaning of love at first sight. Daphne, still bristling, continued her tirade. Sorry doesn't cut it. What's the point of apologies? She was the epitome of a pampered socialite, and I, her devoted, if somewhat mortified, sidekick. A wave of embarrassment washed over me. I hastily intervened, silencing Daphne with a sharp tug on her arm. My gaze remained fixed on the boy before me, my voice breathy with a strange mixture of pain and burgeoning adoration. It's all right. Really, I'm fine. What's your name? Charles Sterling. From that moment, the name, Charles Sterling, took root in my heart, a seed that would blossom into something all-consuming. My pursuit of Charles was arduous, a campaign of relentless devotion. Upon learning of my infatuation, the resident expert on matters of the heart in our dormitory, the ever-wise Beatrice, dispensed her wisdom. Men crave the chase, Eleanor. You need to create opportunities, make him work for it. Let him be the one to declare his feelings. But I was inherently averse to games, to calculated maneuvers. Love, in my naive understanding, was a force of nature, a straightforward, honest emotion. If you felt it, you declared it. Plain and simple. Before my confession, I was brimming with confidence. I was top of our year in our design program, academically gifted, and, while perhaps not conventionally beautiful, certainly not unattractive. In my estimation, I was, if anything, more than a match for Charles. His rejection, therefore, was utterly unforeseen, and the reason he offered, preposterous. Right now, my focus is solely on my studies. Relationships aren't on my radar. If you don't like me, just say it. Why resort to such a flimsy excuse? The words hovered on the tip of my tongue, sharp and accusatory, but I couldn't bring myself to utter them. Fear held me captive. Fear that voicing my hurt would irrevocably sever any chance of a connection between us. I forced a casual tone, feigning nonchalance. Then let's start as friends. When you're ready for a relationship, we can reevaluate. Charles Sterling taught me the profound depths of infatuation. How loving someone could transform you into a cautious, calculating strategist, willing to navigate tortuous detours, even to sacrifice your own self-respect at the altar of affection. I embarked on a campaign of calculated proximity, a relentless pursuit. I meticulously charted his movements, orchestrating chance encounters in hallways, libraries, and the student cafeteria. I brazenly joined him for meals, study sessions, lectures, artfully maneuvering my way into every group project, every collaborative assignment, ensuring our paths were constantly intertwined. Initially, it was the talk of our class. Then, the entire year. Soon, the whole university buzzed with the tale of Eleanor Ainsworth, the design student relentlessly pursuing Charles Sterling. But despite my overtures, Charles remained impassive, unmoved. He never reciprocated my declarations, never voiced any reciprocal feelings, yet he passively allowed my relentless pursuit, never actively discouraging my advances. Daphne, ever the pragmatist, declared his behavior textbook noncommittal. No initiation, no rejection, no responsibility. Dump him, Eleanor. He's not worth it. And after over a year of relentless, unrequited devotion, I finally reached my breaking point. On his birthday, fueled by copious amounts of cheap wine, I confessed my despair in a drunken, tear-soaked monologue. I wished him a lifetime of happiness, a future overflowing with joy, but declared my own departure from his life's journey. The pain, I sobbed, was simply too unbearable. I couldn't continue. But the next morning, I awoke, head throbbing, to find Charles, dark circles etched beneath his eyes, waiting anxiously by my bedside. He gazed at me with an expression of profound remorse, his Tao Hua Yin shimmering with an almost unbearable tenderness. I couldn't sleep, he confessed, his voice low and husky. I spent the entire night thinking, and I realized, I can't be happy without you, Eleanor. Are you still willing to have me? His question was laced with such vulnerability, such unexpected humility, it almost startled me. Why would he even think I wouldn't? In truth, I almost dissolved into tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Tears streamed down my face, unchecked, unbidden. He scrambled to wipe them away, his touch gentle, hesitant. Don't cry, please don't cry. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have put you through this. I do like you, Eleanor. Very much. I didn't think I was good enough for you. Good enough for me. The words hung in the air, utterly unexpected, completely baffling. I stared at him, dumbfounded. Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. You're from the city, Eleanor. I'm from the countryside. You're brilliant, exceptionally talented. I'm ordinary. I couldn't understand what you saw in me. I was terrified you'd realize your mistake, that you'd wake up one day and regret choosing me. But I was also selfish. I craved your warmth, your light. I couldn't bring myself to push you away. I kept telling myself, once I'm better, once I've achieved something, once I'm worthy of you, then I'll let myself be happy. I cut him off, shaking my head, incredulous. You're being ridiculous. You're already wonderful, Charles. Perfectly wonderful. What more do you need to become? A saint. I didn't want a saint. I wanted the flawed, vulnerable, uniquely Charles standing before me. Charles smiled then, a slow, hesitant smile that bloomed across his face, transforming his features, rendering him utterly captivating. He pulled me into his arms, holding me close, his heart beating against mine. You're the ridiculous one, Eleanor Ainsworth. And you have nothing to worry about. I promise you. I will never, ever let you down. If the story ended there, it would be a perfectly saccharine, albeit predictable, romantic comedy. Girl relentlessly pursues initially aloof, but ultimately smitten, boy. They live happily ever after. The end. But life, alas, has no tidy fade-out, no convenient credits roll. Life, with its messy, unpredictable narratives, continued. And our saccharine rom-com, almost imperceptibly, morphed into a domestic drama, a story of disillusionment and quiet heartbreak. Charles was, in those early days, everything I could have dreamed of and more. Back then, we were both living in student dormitories. He wouldn't even allow me to wash my own clothes. He'd insist, gathering my laundry with a gentle possessiveness. My darling's hands, he'd declare, his voice playful, are meant for creating beauty, for wielding paintbrushes, not for the drudgery of laundry. His words always made me laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. They were the kind of words my own mother might have uttered, laced with a similar, doting affection. But your hands are meant for art too. I'd protest, playfully swatting at his arm. He'd look at me then, his gaze serious, his taoyin fixed intently on mine. No, Eleanor. It's different. All hands are meant for art, perhaps, but yours are special. If my relentless pursuit of Charles had once been the source of campus gossip, even ridicule, our subsequent relationship transformed me into something of a campus legend. In Daphne's words, in the entire history of this university, no boyfriend has ever treated his girlfriend as well as Charles Sterling treats Eleanor Ainsworth. You, my dear, are in a fairy tale. And, of course, I continued to excel academically, consistently topping our class. Bathed in the warm glow of Charles's devotion, I felt an almost intoxicating sense of happiness. I poured that happiness into my art, channeling my emotions into the design of a floor lamp that would later win a prestigious national youth design competition. Suddenly, I was a rising star in the design world, a new talent whispered about in hushed, admiring tones. And Charles, seemingly content, became the supportive man behind the scenes, my steadfast champion. Accepting the award, I dedicated it, publicly and sincerely, to Charles. In my heart, the lamp was Charles, embodied in form and light, luminous, gentle, and profoundly warm. But as I descended the stage, award clutched in hand, I caught Charles's expression. A fleeting shadow of something akin to melancholy flickered across his features. He too had entered the competition, I knew, but had only received third prize. His earlier anxieties, his whispered fears of being unworthy, resurfaced in my mind, casting a sudden pall over my triumph. A pang of unease, even regret, pierced through my joy. For me, no accolade, no professional success, could ever eclipse the importance of Charles. If this award, this moment of personal triumph, was to become a wedge between us, a source of unspoken resentment, I would have gladly relinquished it. Daphne often mocked men's fragile egos, their ridiculous insecurities. But in that moment, all I wanted was to protect Charles's pride, to shield him from any perceived slight. I didn't know what to say, how to bridge the sudden, unspoken chasm that seemed to have opened between us. I simply reached for his hand, clasping it tightly in mine. You know why I won, don't you? I asked, my voice soft, searching. Because your design was inspired by me and mine. Mine was inspired by you. And I won. What does that tell you? It means you're still more inspiring than me. Next time, design something inspired by yourself. Charles finally smiled, the shadow lifting from his face. Are you worried my ego is bruised? Terrified, I admitted, my voice still hushed. Silly girl, he murmured, squeezing my hand. Your success is my motivation, Eleanor, never my source of unhappiness. Relief flooded through me, washing away the unease. The buoyant bubbles of happiness, momentarily suppressed by his earlier melancholy, surged back to the surface, effervescent and bright. That night, back at the hotel, emboldened by champagne and relief, I took a deep breath and knocked on Charles's door. He opened it, his eyes widening in surprise. I'd just showered, my skin still flushed from the warm water. I was wearing the little floral sundress I'd carefully chosen for the occasion, the delicate straps slipping off my shoulders, the soft fabric clinging to my curves. I'm sleeping with you tonight, I declared, my voice a little breathless, a little too bold. Charles raised an eyebrow, a playful smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Do you realize what you're suggesting, Eleanor Ainsworth, coming to my room dressed like that? Of course I knew. It means you might be tempted to commit a crime, I whispered, stepping closer, my gaze locking with his. Are you willing to risk it for me? Charles pulled me into his arms, his embrace fierce, possessive. More than willing, he breathed against my hair. More than anything. What followed was as natural, as inevitable, as the turning of the earth. Our intimacy was seamless, harmonious, a merging of souls, as much as bodies. In the aftermath, I felt as if the happiness within me had doubled, tripled, a boundless, overflowing joy, until my award acceptance speech reached my mother's ears. Her reaction was swift, vehement, unequivocal. She vehemently opposed my relationship with a penniless country boy. My mother's blatant snobbery filled me with a profound sense of shame. I tried to explain my feelings for Charles, the depth and sincerity of my love. But my mother remained unmoved, her words sharp and dismissive. Spare me the romantic drivel, Eleanor. Love doesn't pay the bills. You're young, naive. You have no idea the misery you're inviting by marrying beneath yourself. I found my mother's pronouncements utterly ludicrous. We weren't some grand, wealthy family. We were comfortably middle class, yes, but hardly aristocratic. My mother was a homemaker, for goodness sake. And while Charles's family lived in the countryside, they were hardly destitute. His parents were both respected schoolteachers, members of the educated gentry in their rural community. You're a housewife, mother, I retorted, my voice laced with exasperation. And you're lecturing me about marrying beneath myself? Don't you see how ridiculous you sound? The term housewife was a particular sore spot for my mother, a label she considered demeaning. My words, I knew, were a deliberate barb, aimed directly at her insecurities. But for Charles's sake, I was willing to risk her wrath. We clashed, our arguments escalating into furious battles. But eventually, my mother, worn down by my unwavering defiance, offered a grudging compromise. If Charles could secure a stable job in our city, a respectable, urban profession, she would, albeit reluctantly, consider accepting our relationship. Stable, in my mother's lexicon, meant a position within the civil service, a secure, government-backed institution. A demanding, almost impossible hurdle, but still a sliver of hope. Graduation year, the city's prestigious design institute announced open positions. Both Charles and I applied. I scored first place in the entrance exams. Charles came in second. To appease my mother, to secure her blessing for our relationship, I made a difficult sacrifice. I relinquished my first-place ranking, telling my mother I'd come in second, and Charles, miraculously, had topped the list. Charles was vehemently opposed to this deception, this carefully orchestrated lie. But I argued that my excellent undergraduate grades, my near-perfect academic record, would pave the way for graduate studies. I could pursue my master's. To be with me, he reluctantly agreed. And so, Charles secured a coveted position at the Design Institute. And I, armed with my second-place story, was granted permission to pursue my graduate studies, my sights set on marrying Charles upon graduation. But life, in its capricious nature, had other plans. In my second year of graduate school, I discovered I was pregnant. Unexpectedly, overwhelmingly, pregnant. My mother's reaction was immediate and explosive. She absolutely forbade me from keeping the child. A pregnancy, she argued, would mean a year-long academic hiatus, a derailment of my carefully planned future. I was torn. On one hand, this was a tangible manifestation of my love with Charles, a tiny life taking root within me. The thought of terminating the pregnancy was unbearable. But on the other hand, I was woefully unprepared, both emotionally and financially, for motherhood. Charles, ever supportive, declared that he would stand by whatever decision I made. Then, a routine ultrasound revealed the astonishing truth: twins. It was as if fate itself had intervened, making the decision for me. No mother, I reasoned, could willingly terminate a twin pregnancy. Charles, when he heard the news, was overcome with emotion, tears streaming down his face. He vowed to work harder, to provide the best possible life for me and our children. I believed him. Implicitly, completely. I decided to take a year off from my studies, to marry Charles, to embrace motherhood. My decision was met with fierce opposition. My academic advisor, my closest friends, Daphne in particular, all rallied against it. Daphne, drawing on her own painful experience with her father's infidelity, issued dire warnings. Men are the most unreliable creatures on earth, Eleanor. Your career, your independence, that's a woman's true strength. But I, in my youthful idealism, dismissed Daphne's cynicism. Throughout my life, academics had come easily to me, but I wasn't driven by ambition, not in the conventional sense. Drawing had been a childhood pastime, encouraged by a teacher who recognized a nascent talent and dutifully pursued at my mother's behest. Design was a logical progression, a pragmatic choice after years of artistic training. Giving it up felt wasteful. In truth, until Charles, every major decision in my life had been a matter of course, a path of least resistance. Charles was the first truly active choice I had ever made. I trusted my instincts. I believed he was different, fundamentally different, from the vile and vapid men Daphne so readily condemned. Even if the earth shifted on its axis, I was certain his love for me would remain constant, unwavering. I remember telling Daphne, with unwavering conviction, that I was different, that I had no desire to prove my worth through professional achievements. Charles's love is enough, I declared, my voice ringing with youthful certainty. He can build the career. I'll be the supportive wife, the understanding partner. Isn't that easier? His success is my success, isn't it? If I could travel back in time, I would find my younger self, shake her fiercely, and scream the two fundamental truths of marriage into her naive ears. Firstly, understanding someone is far more exhausting, far more demanding, than building a career. Secondly, no one's success, not even your husband's, will ever be as fulfilling, as empowering, as your own. My decision to proceed with the twin pregnancy sent my mother into a paroxysm of fury. She threatened to disown me. I didn't spend years funding your education for you to throw it all away, to become a baby-making machine for some rural nobody at 25. I was enraged by her vitriol, her narrow-mindedness. She was so crude, so materialistic, so utterly devoid of understanding. She didn't grasp the depth of my love, the purity of my intentions. What I craved was her support, her unconditional acceptance. Not her judgment, her condemnation. A mother, I declared, my voice trembling with righteous indignation, should unconditionally support her child's choices. That's what motherhood is supposed to be: unconditional, encompassing, great. When I become a mother, I will never be like you. You don't know a damn thing, my mother had retorted, raising her hand, then hesitating, the blow never landing. Our epic showdown ended in a stalemate, a weary silence. She retreated into her disappointment, I into the anxious anticipation of impending motherhood, until I actually became a mother at 25 to twin daughters. Giving birth to them, holding them in my arms, I finally understood the weight of the word mother. Motherhood was relentless, exhausting, and undeniably, profoundly hard. Because it was a twin pregnancy, and the babies were larger than average, the doctors recommended a C-section at 36 weeks. The surgery was swift, uneventful. And then, I had two tiny, perfect daughters. Wheeled out of the operating room, the first face I saw was my mother's, followed by Charles and his mother. Unlike Charles and my mother-in-law, who wore strained smiles, my mother's face was a mask of disapproval, a thundercloud of unspoken resentment. Still groggy from the anesthesia, knowing she was still angry, I stubbornly declared, "I'm fine. Really, you can go home now." My mother, without a word, turned and left. Later, as the anesthesia wore off, the nurses began the dreaded fundal massage, pressing firmly on my abdomen to contract the uterus. It was, quite simply, excruciating. Pain beyond anything I had ever imagined. In that moment, I thought of my mother. For the first time, a genuine longing for her presence, her comfort, washed over me. But in the 5 days I spent in the hospital, she never visited. When I was discharged, I went home, babies in tow. My mother, despite her initial pronouncements, her hardened exterior, was still my mother. She arrived, unbidden, to help with my postpartum confinement, mais voyez. But on her first day, she clashed with my mother-in-law. To boost my milk supply, my mother-in-law had prepared a rich chicken soup. My mother, however, vehemently opposed it, insisting I drink only the light vegetable and mushroom broth she'd brought from home. I drifted in and out of sleep, the murmur of their argument seeping into my consciousness. I learned that my mother, in a surprising display of maternal dedication, had secretly attended a postpartum care course. The instructors, she explained, had emphasized the importance of a light diet in the first week after childbirth, recommending vegetable broths and discouraging rich meat soups. My mother also criticized my mother-in-law for using factory-farmed chicken, not free-range, for the soup, arguing that it lacked any nutritional value. Cradling my 2 sleeping infants, listening to my mother and mother-in-law bicker in the kitchen, I began to cry. Not from the pain of the C-section, not from the agony of the fundal massage. Listening to my mother, the woman I had so vehemently argued with, the woman who had ultimately, begrudgingly, compromised for my sake, arguing with my mother-in-law over a bowl of soup, tears welled up and overflowed. I suddenly understood. Someday, when these tiny daughters in my arms were grown, I would likely find myself embroiled in similar petty squabbles, battling with those who, while perhaps well-meaning, simply weren't good enough for my girls. Not good enough. And who, in this vast world, would ever be good enough? Who could love them as fiercely, as unconditionally, as I did? The soup incident was merely the first skirmish. Similar battles erupted in the weeks that followed. Eventually, my mother effectively usurped my mother-in-law's caregiving role, leaving my mother-in-law adrift, unsure whether to stay or leave. To placate my mother, to somehow navigate this minefield of maternal opinions, Charles, my mother-in-law, and I convened several tense family meetings. My mother-in-law, frustrated and bewildered, cataloged my mother's seemingly arbitrary demands. The eggs, she complained, had to be rinsed under running water before boiling. The tap water-washed fruit required a final rinse in purified water. No amount of explanation could bridge the chasm of understanding. My mother-in-law simply couldn't grasp the logic. We're boiling the eggs. We're not drinking the shell water. We're not eating the shells. Why must the raw eggshells be washed? After several such meetings, Charles, overwhelmed and out of his depth, realized that no amount of diplomacy could appease both mothers. He retreated, seeking refuge in the familiar sanctuary of work. It was, perhaps, the first time I truly recognized his limitations, his inherent helplessness in the face of domestic complexities. He loved me, he declared, repeatedly, earnestly. But his love, I realized with a dawning sense of disappointment, was utterly impotent in resolving the practicalities of our life. He could escape to the office, to the demands of his career. But I, confined to the home, trapped in the relentless cycle of motherhood, had no escape. Finally, during yet another weary, exasperated outburst from my mother, lamenting the mistake I'd made in marrying into this family, I snapped. "This is my life, mother," I'd retorted, my voice sharp with exhaustion and resentment. "My choice, not yours. If you find it so unbearable, so wrong, then go home. Please, just go." My mother, mid-scoop of freshly cooked ribs, froze. Hearing my words, she hurled the ribs into the trash, a dramatic gesture of wounded pride. She declared, with theatrical finality, that even if Charles were to abuse me, abandon me in the streets, she would never, ever interfere in my life again. And so began my solitary journey into motherhood, co-parenting with my mother-in-law, a well-meaning but often bewildering presence. Before the babies were born, my mother-in-law had assured me, "Just have the children, Eleanor. Don't worry about anything else. Go back to school. Finish your degree. That's all that matters." I was grateful for her support and naively optimistic. I believed, with a youthful arrogance, that I could manage it all. But motherhood, I soon discovered, was a force of nature, an all-consuming vortex. For Lily and Rose, I was indispensable, irreplaceable, and my mother-in-law's childcare practices left much to be desired. She refused to use disposable diapers, convinced they were uncomfortable, suffocating. The sheer volume of cloth diapers, the endless cycle of washing, rinsing, and drying, threatened to overwhelm me. I'd hoped Charles might mediate, might somehow bridge the generational divide, might reason with his mother. But his response was invariably the same, a mantra of weary resignation. "My mother means well, Eleanor. Just bear with it. Try to understand. For my sake." And so, the "she means well, just bear with it, try to understand" trilogy became the soundtrack of my marriage. 9 simple words, uttered with a dismissive wave of the hand, perpetually positioned Charles and his mother on a morally superior plane. They meant well. They were acting in good faith. But in the relentless, mundane reality of domestic life, meaning well was often indistinguishable from not caring at all. And my inability to bear with it, my refusal to understand, somehow rendered me the imperfect wife, the unreasonable partner. 6 months postpartum, desperate to reclaim some semblance of my former self, I resolved to return to university to finally complete my graduate thesis. But barely had I begun to find my creative rhythm when disaster struck. My mother-in-law, left alone with the twins for an afternoon, had an accident. She'd put the girls down for their afternoon nap, then fallen asleep herself. When the twins awoke, she hadn't stirred. It was Rose, tumbling from her crib to the floor, her piercing cries finally rousing my mother-in-law from her slumber. Already teetering on the edge of emotional collapse, overwhelmed by the academic pressure of catching up with my peers, the sight of Rose's tear-streaked face, the faint bruise blooming on her forehead, pushed me over the brink. Standing in the middle of our small living room, I unleashed a primal scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. Even in the midst of my own hysteria, I recognized, with chilling clarity, I am losing my mind. My outburst terrified my mother-in-law and Charles. They stood frozen, each cradling a twin, their eyes wide with fear, staring at me as if I were a creature from another world. When the screaming subsided, replaced by ragged breaths and trembling limbs, I rounded on my mother-in-law, my voice hoarse, accusing. Why couldn't she have been more vigilant, more alert? My mother-in-law offered no defense, no explanation. Instead, stung by my accusation, she retreated, packing her bags and returning to her rural home. Charles, predictably, took his mother's side. It was an accident, Eleanor. She didn't do it on purpose. Why can't you ever just understand? That was the moment, standing in the aftermath of my own emotional explosion, that my disappointment in Charles crystallized. He was, I realized, with a sinking heart, fundamentally incapable of providing true support, true partnership, in the messy, demanding reality of family life. His only weapon, his only recourse, was the weary refrain. Try to understand. Of course, I knew my mother-in-law hadn't intentionally harmed Rose. She was elderly, her energy waning. Falling asleep during nap time was understandable. I should understand. But my disappointment wasn't directed at her. It was directed at him. At Charles. He could extend endless empathy and understanding to his mother, but none to his wife, his partner, who was simultaneously drowning in academic deadlines, guilt-ridden over Rose's injury, and teetering on the precipice of emotional breakdown. He hadn't offered a word of comfort, not a single gesture of support. It was in that moment, standing in the sterile quiet of our home, that I understood, with chilling clarity, the profound isolation of marriage. In this partnership, I was utterly alone. Waiting outside the emergency room of the children's hospital, clutching Rose tightly in my arms, I made a decision. A firm, unwavering commitment to myself. I would care for Lily and Rose. I would be their primary caregiver. I was their mother. I had brought them into this world. The responsibility was mine, and mine alone. If I didn't prioritize their well-being, if I didn't dedicate myself fully to their care, who else would? Who else could I trust to love them, protect them, nurture them with the same unwavering devotion? And so, I applied for a leave of absence, a deferral of my graduation. My academic advisor was furious. Her disappointment was palpable, a tangible weight in the air. She pointed a finger at me, her voice sharp with barely suppressed anger. My decision, she declared, was a betrayal of my talent, a waste of my potential. Eleanor Ainsworth, she'd hissed, her voice laced with bitterness. You are not only squandering your own gifts, but you've also wasted a precious graduate school slot. If I had known you were capable of such mediocrity, I would never have accepted your application. If you're determined to bury yourself in domesticity, then forget about graduating. Just go home. And yet, despite her harsh words, her palpable disappointment, she continued to guide me, to mentor me, to pour her time and energy into my thesis. I understood, with profound gratitude, the depth of her investment, the fierce protectiveness that fueled her anger. Love in its harshest, most demanding form. The guilt I felt, the weight of her disappointment, became my reluctant motivator. In countless moments of despair, when the urge to surrender, to simply collapse into the comfortable anonymity of Charles Sterling's wife, threatened to overwhelm me, it was her anger, her unwavering belief in my potential, that spurred me onward, that kept me tethered to my own identity, my own aspirations. Had I given up then, had I succumbed to the suffocating expectations of domesticity, my current predicament would be infinitely more dire. In the fleeting moments of quiet, during the children's naps, in the stolen hours after they were asleep, I worked. Piece by piece, fragment by fragment, I pieced together my thesis, wrote my design statement, clung to the fragile thread of my professional identity. The night before my thesis defense, at midnight, a text message from my advisor illuminated my phone screen. 5 words, stark and simple. Dress nicely tomorrow, Eleanor. The moment I read those words, tears welled up, blurring my vision. Just 5 words. But in those 5 words, I understood everything. Beyond the chaos of diapers and dishes, beyond the endless cycle of domesticity, she wanted me to reclaim my identity, to step back into the role of graduate student. She wanted me to face my defense with dignity, with pride. She wanted me, in the years to come, to look back at the photos of that day and feel a sense of accomplishment, not regret. That night, I cried. Tears of gratitude, tears of exhaustion, tears of a deep, aching loneliness. In that moment, I felt, with a profound certainty, that my advisor, in some fundamental way, was another mother to me. And yet, I had failed them both. My biological mother, my academic mother. As a mother myself, I had no choice but to fail my mothers. Because that very night, Rose spiked a fever, and Charles, predictably, had a business trip scheduled for the following day, the day of my thesis defense. I was forced to forego my graduation ceremony. Initially, I'd insisted that Charles postpone his trip, that he take Rose to the hospital, allowing me to attend my defense. But Charles had countered, his voice laced with self-righteous indignation. The project, he argued, was critical to his career trajectory. He couldn't possibly miss it. Furious, I'd erupted. We'd engaged in a bitter, acrimonious argument. Every step of our relationship, Charles, I'd accused, my voice trembling with rage and despair. From leaving school to marry you, to having Lily and Rose, to deferring my graduation to raise them, I have been the one to compromise. Just once, for once in our marriage, couldn't you make a sacrifice for me? Couldn't you let me have this one thing? Couldn't you let me attend my graduation ceremony? Charles had stared back at me, his expression a mask of injured innocence, of bewildered self-pity. This project, he'd whined, is incredibly important to my career. It's a crucial moment. If I don't go, my promotion, my raise, it will all be jeopardized. Your graduation ceremony. You'll still graduate, whether you attend the ceremony or not. From a purely practical standpoint, Eleanor, you need to be reasonable. You need to prioritize. I'm doing this for Lily and Rose, for their future. Why can't you ever just understand? I hadn't regretted marrying Charles when I'd left graduate school, hadn't regretted choosing motherhood when Lily and Rose were born. But hearing him utter the word practicality, hearing him reduce my life, my aspirations, my very self-worth to a matter of cost-benefit analysis, I felt a profound, visceral surge of regret. Because the Charles standing before me, the man I had once adored, was no longer capable of seeing my disappointment, of acknowledging my pain. In our marriage, he had become emotionally deaf, emotionally blind, emotionally absent. As the argument reached its bitter, unresolved conclusion, I'd uttered words I never thought I would say, words that hung heavy in the air between us, irrevocably altering the landscape of our relationship. If it's just about practicality, Charles, I'd stated, my voice cold, devoid of emotion, then let me be perfectly clear. From a purely practical standpoint, Eleanor Ainsworth would never have chosen to marry Charles Sterling. Charles had stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief, of wounded bewilderment, as if I had uttered the most hurtful, the most unforgivable words imaginable. But in that moment, I no longer cared. I no longer cared what he thought, what he felt, what he believed. Being a mother was truly arduous. Being a mother to twins wasn't just hardship squared, it was hardship cubed. There was a phase when both girls would decide to have bowel movements simultaneously. On one hand, I was relieved by their regular bodily functions, a sign of their good health. It was a mother's strange comfort, finding reassurance in the mundane realities of bodily processes. On the other hand, rapidly cleaning 2 little bottoms in quick succession was genuinely a feat of logistical maneuvering. If I cleaned Lily first, Rose's bottom would inevitably suffer, becoming encrusted with dried excrement. If I prioritized Rose, Lily would be left lying in a puddle of her own mess. Once, having just finished cleaning one bottom and midway through cleaning the other, I heard the baby airing her freshly cleaned bottom on the bed, begin to coo and gurgle. I turned to investigate, only to find she'd promptly soiled herself again. A fresh deposit, a cruel joke from the diaper gods. Then there were the terrible twos, that infamous developmental stage when Lily and Rose morphed into tiny, tantrum-throwing tyrants. They would frequently erupt into inconsolable wails when I dared to thwart their dangerous escapades. My patience, alas, was not an infinite resource. And so, there were days, far too many to count, when the three of us would dissolve into a cacophony of tears, a symphony of maternal and infantile distress. Of course, being a mother to these two precious beings also yielded happiness cubed. And the transition between the hardship and the happiness could be so sudden, so unexpected, as to leave me breathless. One particularly harrowing day, amidst one of our collective crying jags, Rose, still sobbing, abruptly reached out, taking her tiny handkerchief and patting it against my wet cheek. "Wipe tears," she mumbled between sniffles, a miniature caregiver in training. Quickly mimicking her sister, Lily grabbed her own handkerchief and began vigorously scrubbing at my face. "Wipe tears," she echoed, her small face contorted with concern. Tears still blurring my vision, I gazed at these two miniature comforters, these tiny, empathetic souls, and a chuckle escaped my lips, bubbling up from the depths of my exhaustion and despair. Seeing my smile, Lily and Rose's sobs abruptly ceased, replaced by peals of delighted laughter, the sound echoing through the suddenly brighter room. On my 27th birthday, when they were just over 2, Rose was the first to declare, "Mama, love you." Her small voice, clear and sweet, filled the room. Immediately, Lily, not to be outdone, piped up in her slightly deeper voice, "Mama, love you more." Then, a chorus of "Love Mama more, love Mama most," erupted, the sweet, childish voices vying for my attention, for my affection. In that moment, surrounded by their pure, unadulterated love, I genuinely believed I was the luckiest mother in the world. Heaven, in its infinite wisdom, had seen fit to send me two veritable little angels. While I frantically navigated the steep learning curve of motherhood, desperately trying to become the mother my daughters deserved, Charles, their father, became an increasingly elusive presence in our home. Employed at the Design Institute, Charles, following my lead from years before, had pursued a master's degree under the tutelage of his department head, beginning the year after I'd started my own master's program. After graduation, he gradually garnered the favor of senior leadership, his workload expanding exponentially, his responsibilities multiplying. He was increasingly burdened, increasingly important. As his involvement in family life dwindled, the onus of domesticity, of childcare, fell squarely on my shoulders. I absorbed it without complaint, almost willingly. Initially, I hadn't resented it. I was happy to be the woman behind the man, the supportive partner. Hadn't I always said his success was my success? As long as Charles acknowledged my contributions, my sacrifices, I felt it was all worthwhile. Besides, Charles often declared me his muse, his inspiration. He insisted that every achievement, every professional triumph, was in some way attributable to me, that I was intrinsically woven into the fabric of his success. I'd naively assumed that once the girls started kindergarten, I'd finally have the breathing room to re-enter the workforce, to reclaim my own professional identity. But kindergarten, it turned out, came with its own set of demands, its own form of relentless pressure, endless homework assignments for parents, extracurricular activities, school events. My carefully laid plans for a professional resurgence crumbled under the weight of these new obligations. Charles, ever practical, pointed out that his income comfortably covered all household expenses. There was no financial necessity for me to work. My primary responsibility, he asserted, was to be present for the children, to nurture them, to guide them. "Let me take care of you, Eleanor," he'd said, the words laced with a sweet, almost paternal affection. At the time, I hadn't grasped the insidious irony, the subtle foreshadowing, contained within that seemingly tender declaration. That seemingly loving promise of security would ultimately become the very thing that eroded our love, that ultimately fractured our marriage. As the girls grew older, their emotional needs intensified, their demands on my time and energy multiplied. I began to feel overwhelmed, stretched thin, constantly teetering on the edge of exhaustion. Lost in the relentless whirlwind of domesticity, consumed by the minutiae of childcare, my relationship with Charles slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to fray. At some point, subtly, insidiously, Charles ceased to treat me as an equal partner, as a fellow adult capable of intellectual exchange, of meaningful conversation. In fact, it wasn't even I who initially noticed this shift. It was Charles himself who, in a moment of unexpected candor, pointed it out. One evening, he returned home late from a work dinner, long after the children and I were asleep. I woke in the pre-dawn hours, bleary-eyed, needing to use the bathroom. I found him sitting in the darkened living room, still fully dressed in his work attire, his overcoat draped across his shoulders. I asked him why he hadn't changed, reminding him that once he was home, he should shed the day's burdens, change into comfortable clothes. He responded with an unexpected wave of self-pity, his voice laced with wounded resentment. He lamented that in the old days, I would have left a light on for him, waited up, to share a quiet moment before bed, eager to hear about his day, his work. But now, he accused, I was solely preoccupied with myself, oblivious to his needs, neglecting him. I blinked, momentarily stunned by the unexpected accusation. All I could muster was a weary, "I'm tired," before retreating back to bed, seeking refuge in sleep. That night, he slept on the sofa, a silent, sulking exile. The next morning, his eyes red-rimmed and accusing, he confronted me. "Tired? You think you're tired? Do you even comprehend how exhausting my life is? I'm working 24/7, Eleanor. The Institute is constantly demanding. Every minor and major issue lands on my desk. I'm juggling a dozen projects at work, plus another half-dozen freelance gigs on the side. And who am I doing it all for? For you and the girls. And you can't even be bothered to show me a little concern? It makes me feel like all my hard work, all my sacrifices, they're utterly meaningless." I stared at him, speechless, a wave of weary disbelief washing over me. I hesitated, wondering if I should even attempt to recount the mundane realities of my day, the relentless demands of my own invisible labor. That day, I had single-handedly taken both girls for their vaccinations, returned home to cook lunch. During their nap, I'd hand-washed the clothes soiled with inevitable toddler mishaps from the clinic visit. To reward their bravery during the shots, I'd spent the afternoon at the local playground, chasing after them, refereeing squabbles, for over 3 hours. We'd arrived home just before 7. I'd baked them a quick pizza for dinner, then wrestled 2 squirming toddlers through bath time, carefully protecting the injection sites with waterproof bandages, a detail only a mother would consider. After baths, I tidied the chaotic aftermath of their day. Just before bed, reaching under Lily's crib for a dropped toy, I'd twisted my back, a sharp, searing pain shooting through my lower spine. It was only then, in a rare concession to my own exhaustion, that I'd tossed the playground clothes into the washing machine, abandoning my usual practice of hand washing. After the girls were finally asleep, I'd found a tube of expired pain relief cream and applied it to my aching back, collapsing into bed, sleep claiming me almost instantly. This was my daily reality, a relentless cycle of exhaustion and unwavering devotion. I hesitated to begin, unsure where to even start. To meticulously detail the intricate tapestry of my day would require an immense amount of explanation, a significant expenditure of precious energy. But my silence, my weary hesitation, seemed to embolden Charles, to fuel his self-righteous indignation. He gazed at me with an expression of profound disappointment. "I know you're tired, Eleanor. That's why I've never complained about the state of the house. It's always a mess, but I've never said a word. My colleague's wife, she irons his shirts every single day, perfectly crisp. You've never ironed a single shirt for me, but have I complained? No. All I ask for is a little verbal acknowledgement, a little concern. And even that is apparently too much to expect. And when I try to talk to you about work," he continued, his voice rising in pitch, "you're always distracted, your mind elsewhere. You feel like a stranger to me now, Eleanor. You're not the woman I married." Watching Charles's impassioned tirade, his self-pitying monologue, I felt a strange detachment, an almost clinical amusement. He was, in this moment, truly ridiculous. Precisely because I knew how demanding his work was, I had deliberately refrained from burdening him with the minutiae of my own struggles. We had an unspoken division of labor. I was responsible for the domestic sphere, for the relentless demands of childcare. He was responsible for financial provision, for securing our family's future. We each focused on our designated roles, striving to excel, to alleviate the burdens of the other, working in tandem for the shared future of Lily and Rose. Or so I had believed. This, I thought, was our mutual understanding, our unspoken pact. I, the woman behind the man, the supportive wife. I had diligently striven to embody that role, to be understanding of his demanding career, to grant him the space he seemingly needed. There was a popular meme circulating online at the time, a humorous observation titled, "Has anyone else noticed their husband pooping more since having kids?" When I'd first encountered it, I'd been struck by the internet's collective wisdom, its uncanny ability to distill universal truths into pithy, relatable humor. And it was then, prompted by this internet jest, that I'd begun to notice a pattern. Whenever Charles was home, he adhered to a remarkably consistent bowel routine. Once in the morning, once in the evening, as regular and predictable as clockwork. In the 7 or 8 years we'd been together, before children, when we'd spent our evenings studying together in the library, watching movies, his nocturnal habits had been different, less frequent. But I understood. I genuinely did. He needed space, a private sanctuary within the chaotic confines of our family life. I even imagined he was likely unaware of this subtle physiological shift, that his subconscious need for solitude had manifested in this intestinal adjustment. And so, I had never mentioned it. Not a word, not even a raised eyebrow. Unwittingly, my understanding, my empathy, my deliberate silence had been misinterpreted, transformed into a sense of entitlement on his part. My concessions became expected, my sacrifices rendered invisible. His demanding career, his frequent absences, were recast as heroic endeavors, acts of selfless devotion. And now, he was berating me for failing to iron his shirts. The Charles who had once declared, "Eleanor Ainsworth's hands are meant for art," was, it seemed, long gone. Perhaps dead. I simply lacked the energy for confrontation, for argument. I didn't respond, didn't engage. Silence, weary and heavy, became my only defense. My silence, my passive resignation, seemed to further disappoint him. In the days and weeks that followed, he withdrew, ceasing to share anything about his work, erecting an invisible wall between us. Until that day, the day Charles received his award, the day he publicly thanked his muse in his acceptance speech, broadcast live to the world. I had assumed, naively, that I was his muse. But I was wrong. His muse, it turned out, was Juliana. Juliana Bellwether, the 22-year-old woman who had gifted him the infantile Starbucks cup. When Charles returned home from the awards ceremony, late as always, I didn't immediately confront him about the muse revelation. He arrived in the dead of night. I heard the faint click of the front door latch, the rustle of his clothes as he undressed, the murmur of the shower as he washed away the evening's accolades. Then, he slipped into bed beside me, the familiar scent of his sandalwood soap filling the air. Turning my back to him, feigning sleep, I closed my eyes. A profound sadness settled over me. Even enveloped in his familiar scent, surrounded by the ghosts of our shared intimacy, he felt like a stranger. Tears welled up, silent and unseen in the darkness. Then, the faint glow of his phone screen illuminated the room, a rhythmic pulse of light in the darkness. Intending to wait until morning, to gather my composure, I found myself unable to restrain the question any longer. "Your muse," I whispered into the darkness, my voice barely audible. "You've changed muses, haven't you?" The room fell silent again, the darkness deepening, swallowing my words. After a long, agonizing pause, he finally responded, his voice low, almost defensive. "Well, the initial inspiration for that design. It did come from Juliana. We're a team, Eleanor. But only I received the award. It would have been inappropriate, impolite, unseemly not to acknowledge her contribution. Unseemly. The word hung in the air, heavy with irony. All I felt was that the man who uttered such words had utterly lost all sense of what true seemliness actually meant. I said nothing more, simply raised a hand to wipe away the tears that continued to silently track down my cheeks. Soon, the room descended into utter silence, a suffocating void. Then, after a while, the faint, rhythmic pulse of his phone screen began again, casting its pale, intermittent glow across the room. In the flickering light, amidst the encroaching darkness, I recalled his words from our recent argument. "You're not the woman I married, Eleanor." What was the woman he had married? The Eleanor Ainsworth he had married was a woman who had consistently topped her class, brimming with ambition, radiating confidence, certain that her future held a position of prominence, a place among the stars of her chosen field. And the Eleanor Ainsworth of today? She was a mother to twin daughters. She was the wife of Charles Sterling, the acclaimed designer, the man now standing at the very pinnacle of professional success. And I had been instrumental in placing him there, in nurturing his talent, in supporting his ascent. Yet, the view from the summit, the accolades, the public recognition, he was now sharing with another. Following the Muse incident, Juliana Bellwether sought me out. An unannounced visit, a carefully orchestrated performance of contrition. She claimed she had been utterly surprised by Charles's public acknowledgement. Honestly, Mrs. Sterling, I only offered a few minor suggestions. Professor Charles's description of me as his muse was incredibly flattering, completely undeserved. I was so worried you might misunderstand, might feel slighted. I wanted to assure you, Mrs. Sterling, that my relationship with Professor Charles is purely professional. We are simply close colleagues. I deeply admire his talent, and he's been incredibly supportive of me. I truly envy you, Mrs. Sterling, being married to such an accomplished man. The Juliana Bellwether standing before me was impeccably made up, elegantly dressed in a figure-hugging knit dress that emphasized her impossibly slender waist. She radiated an air of polished confidence, of effortless chic. She was, undeniably, more muse-like than the disheveled, perpetually exhausted, perpetually house-dressed woman I had become. She claimed her visit was an apology, a gesture of reconciliation. But every aspect of her presentation, from her carefully crafted demeanor to her subtly condescending tone, reeked of thinly veiled gloating, of blatant provocation. She was flaunting my husband's attention, his professional respect, his designation of her as his muse. A childish power play, transparent and pathetic. She likely expected to elicit a fiery outburst, to provoke a dramatic confrontation. But I felt nothing. No anger, no jealousy, no resentment. I was utterly indifferent to her words, her carefully constructed performance. My only concern was Charles, his intentions, his true feelings. And it was becoming increasingly clear. Charles had profoundly disappointed me. From that day forward, the evidence of his emotional withdrawal, of his shifting affections, became glaringly apparent, accumulating like damning exhibits in a trial. He began sharing songs, jokes, photographs, the minutiae of his day, the small moments of beauty and humor, not with me, but with Juliana. He went to elaborate lengths, enlisting friends to procure a particularly rare Starbucks cup, unavailable domestically, from overseas for Juliana. But, for my birthday, I received a perfunctory bouquet of roses, delivered by a courier, a gesture devoid of any personal touch, any genuine sentiment. The delivery man, upon handing me the flowers, recited the pre-printed message on the card with theatrical sincerity. "Happy birthday, wife." I signed for the bouquet, then immediately thrust it back into the delivery man's hands, asking him to dispose of it in the public trash bin downstairs. He stared at me, bewildered, his eyes wide with confusion. But I offered no explanation. I couldn't explain to a stranger that the man who had sent these flowers had once vehemently declared, "Men who give flowers as gifts are unimaginative, devoid of creativity. Anyone with a shred of genuine sentiment can devise a more thoughtful, more personal gift than a generic bouquet." Charles's dismissive bouquet felt like a deliberate message, a pointed reminder. The Eleanor Ainsworth who now stood in the shadows of a successful man was no longer worthy of genuine effort, of sincere consideration. Closing the door behind the departing delivery man, I returned to the living room, resuming my place beside Lily and Rose on the sofa, settling in to watch cartoons as if nothing had happened. But inside, a quiet resolve was hardening. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I had to reclaim myself, to rediscover the woman I once was. To become, once again, the Eleanor Ainsworth who deserved genuine effort, who commanded sincere regard. Eleanor Ainsworth, it was time for your comeback. Time to re-emerge, to reclaim your own narrative. If there was one person in this world you were destined to disappoint, it was probably your own mother. Disappointing anyone else came with a price, a complex web of consequences. But disappointing your mother? That, perhaps, was the transgression with the lowest cost. Like my own mother, who, despite our frequent clashes, still periodically appeared at my doorstep to criticize and help. It was to her, ironically, that I turned in my moment of greatest need. Entrusting the girls to her care, I steeled myself and contacted my former academic advisor. My advisor, this time, refrained from scolding. She simply instructed me to return home and await her call. 3 or 4 days later, my advisor summoned me to a meeting, reiterating her previous instruction: "Dress nicely, Eleanor." On the day of the meeting, I instructed my mother to collect the girls from kindergarten. Fate, in its unpredictable nature, intervened. Charles, for reasons unknown, returned home early that afternoon, only to find my mother presiding over the twins, feeding them a takeout meal of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Lily and Rose, delighted by their father's unexpected arrival, eagerly offered him a piece of their fried chicken. Charles, however, recoiled in horror, turning to my mother with a disapproving frown. "You shouldn't be feeding them fried food," he chastised. My mother, who had never harbored any particular fondness for Charles, retorted sharply, "Then you take care of your own children." Charles, incensed, immediately called me, his voice tight with indignation. His first complaint: my mother was utterly unreasonable. His second: I, as their mother, was irresponsible. Leaving the luncheon meeting with my advisor under her critical gaze, I answered Charles's call, my voice calm, measured. "Firstly, mother is right. If you object to fried food, then you can take over childcare responsibilities. Secondly, regardless of my supposed irresponsibility, have you, as their father, actually been responsible? Charles sputtered, momentarily speechless, before launching into a defensive tirade. How can you say I'm not responsible? I'm working day and night to provide for this family. We don't need you to work, Eleanor. My income is more than sufficient. Your only job is to care for the children. Why are you so determined to go back to work? It's completely unnecessary. His words echoed a distant memory, a conversation from years ago when our twins were infants. He had once declared that he would never forget my sacrifices, that my willingness to prioritize family over career had paved the way for his own success. But now, when I sought to reclaim my professional aspirations, he accused me of irresponsibility. It was in that precise moment, listening to his self-serving justifications, that my last vestiges of affection for Charles finally evaporated. I informed him, my voice flat, devoid of emotion, that I was indeed returning to work. The children would be cared for by my mother. Whether he approved or not was irrelevant. My decision was made. Moving forward, childcare responsibilities would be shared equally between us. Charles accused me of selfishness, of prioritizing my own career ambitions over the well-being of our children. He seemed genuinely bewildered, utterly unable to comprehend my motivations. Why are you doing this, Eleanor? Why are you making things so difficult? Isn't being the woman behind my success enough for you? You're a mother. Your children need you. Can't you be less selfish? His words, laced with self-pity and thinly veiled condescension, were almost comical in their absurdity. My response was equally direct, equally devoid of emotion. You're a father, Charles. Your children need you too. If you're so selfless, so concerned about their well-being, why don't you resign from your demanding job? I'll support you. You can be the man behind my success. Wouldn't that be better? Charles sputtered, aghast. Fathers and mothers are different. Besides, I earn more than you ever could. I cut him off, my voice sharp. You earn more now, Charles. But that financial disparity is a direct result of my sacrifices, of my willingness to dedicate my artistic hands to domestic drudgery, to laundry, and cooking and childcare. Now, it's your turn to reciprocate. It's your turn to make a sacrifice for me. After all, I'm the one with the talent, the potential. I'll likely surpass your income in no time. This time, he fell silent, utterly deflated. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a surge of exhilarating liberation. Using his own logic against him, wielding his own weapons, was unexpectedly satisfying. Then came the Starbucks cup incident, and my unwavering decision to leave. That day, Juliana's tears flowed freely, copious and theatrical. Large, glistening droplets traced paths down her meticulously made-up cheeks. She looked as if she wished she could tear open her chest, expose her heart for my inspection. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Sterling, she sobbed. Professor Charles truly loves you. If my presence has caused any misunderstanding, I sincerely apologize. Juliana, I interrupted, my voice calm, almost gentle. This isn't about you. You have nothing to apologize for. In that moment, Charles transformed into a protective patriarch, a fierce defender of his injured brood. His Tao Hua Yin, once soft and inviting, now blazed with protective fury, all directed towards Juliana, all radiating concern for her distress. He turned to me, his eyes burning with righteous anger. Eleanor, this is a matter between husband and wife. We'll discuss this at home. Thankfully, the familiar pang of heartbreak was absent, replaced by a weary indifference. I offered Juliana a warmer smile than I ever offered Charles. Professor Sterling is right, Juliana. Please, don't blame yourself. Flies don't land on cracked eggs, as the saying goes. The person I hold responsible in all of this is most certainly not you. Charles's face contorted with rage. Eleanor Ainsworth, he roared, his voice echoing through the office. I turned to him, offering a saccharine smile. Indeed, darling. Now, perhaps we should go home and discuss these marital matters of ours. Back home, Charles remained thunderous, his face a mask of simmering resentment. Eleanor, you were completely out of line. That public display. It made it look like something actually happened between Juliana and me. Juliana is just a young woman, Eleanor. How is she supposed to face her colleagues after this? You've ruined her reputation. The sheer absurdity of his concern, his misplaced priorities, almost comical. This man, who had once vowed, with such earnest conviction, to never let me down, had now inflicted profound emotional damage, and his primary concern was his muse's professional reputation. A hollow laugh escaped my lips. Charles, I said, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Do you honestly believe this is just a scene? Do you want to see a real scene, Charles? Because I assure you, I am more than capable of creating one. Charles flinched, momentarily silenced, before rallying, his voice regaining its accusatory edge. You wouldn't dare? I met his gaze, unwavering, unafraid. You're wrong, Charles. I would dare, but I won't. Not because I fear you, but because you're simply not worth the effort. Only a woman who still harbors hope for reconciliation would resort to dramatic scenes with her cheating husband. And I, Charles, have no desire for reconciliation. I don't want you anymore. I want a divorce. Charles scoffed, a dismissive snort. Divorce? Don't try to threaten me with divorce, Eleanor. You're just playing on the fact that you have Lily and Rose. He truly believed I was bluffing, that my threat was merely a manipulative tactic. For a fleeting moment, I was unsure whether to feel pity for his utter delusion or sorrow for my own misjudgment in ever choosing him. I packed bags for myself and the girls and moved back to my mother's house. I didn't disclose my intention to divorce her, not yet. I planned to secure a new home, establish a semblance of stability, before revealing the full extent of my plans. My mother, assuming this was just another marital spat, another temporary separation, offered her full support. Good riddance, she declared. Give him a taste of life without you. Charles, equally misinformed, also seemed to believe this was just a cooling-off period, a temporary estrangement. He made no attempt to contact me. It wasn't until I found a new apartment, finalized the lease, and the moving company arrived to pack my belongings that the reality of the situation finally dawned on him. On moving day, as movers began carrying boxes, clearly labeled and meticulously packed weeks in advance, out the front door, Charles's carefully constructed facade of denial finally crumbled. His face registered dawning comprehension, then disbelief, then a dazed bewilderment. Eleanor, he stammered, his voice thick with confusion, what are you doing? What have I done to deserve this? I was utterly overwhelmed, unsure where to even begin to unravel the tangled web of his transgressions, his emotional neglect, his fundamental misunderstanding of our marriage. I can't even begin to explain, I sighed, the words heavy with weariness. He blocked my path, his body rigid, his eyes pleading. You have to explain, Eleanor. At least tell me, after all these years, after everything we've shared. You owe me an explanation. Not to mention, you haven't worked a day since we got married. I've been the one working myself to the bone to support this family. All these years, you've wanted for nothing. Have I ever denied you anything? When had Charles become so utterly devoid of self-awareness? So breathtakingly shameless? It was an unanswerable question, a riddle wrapped in layers of disappointment and disillusionment. Instead of arguing, instead of attempting to dissect the complexities of our fractured marriage, I simply bowed deeply, a gesture of formal acknowledgement, of weary resignation. Then, straightening, I met his gaze directly, my voice steady. For supporting us, for providing for me and our daughters all these years, thank you, Charles. Is that sufficient? Charles stood frozen, his face paling, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling around him. That's not what I meant, he stammered, his voice losing its accusatory edge. Then what did you mean, Charles? I managed a wry smile, a hollow, humorless curve of my lips. I always believed that when I sacrificed my career, my ambitions, to marry you, to bear your children, to dedicate myself to our home, you might not be grateful, but you would at least recognize it as a sacrifice. But it seems, in your eyes, I'm nothing more than a dependent, a burden you've been supporting, a useless appendage you've been providing for. Yes, Charles, you've provided for me. You've bought me everything I've wanted. Bottles, diapers, formula, picture books, toys. You've bought them all, in duplicate. Yes, and you even bought me a double stroller. You've been so generous, Charles. Truly. Commendable. I should give you a medal. And you know what else I want, Charles? I want bicycles for the girls. I want tickets to Disneyland. But don't worry, Charles. You don't need to provide anymore. I can buy them myself now. I can buy anything I want. I pushed past him, heading towards the open front door, towards the waiting moving truck, towards my own uncertain future. A flicker of genuine remorse finally crossed his face, a fleeting shadow of guilt in his eyes. I know you've made sacrifices, Eleanor. I've always known. That's why, even when I felt something for Juliana, I resisted it. I knew I couldn't betray you. I still want to make this work, Eleanor. I still want us to be a family. He had finally articulated the truth, the confession I had been waiting for, however belatedly, however grudgingly. But his remorse, his apology, was so profoundly self-serving, so utterly tone-deaf, it was almost comical. In a darkly tragic way, Charles, I said, turning back to face him, my voice quiet, resolute. Why do you assume, so arrogantly, that Eleanor Ainsworth is destined to make it work, to be a family, with a man who neither loves nor values her? I stepped closer, each word a deliberate strike, a sharp slap to his carefully constructed ego. You overestimate yourself, Charles. I've told you, Charles, I don't want you anymore. I don't want this anymore. I'm leaving. Perhaps, in my years of playing the role of the understanding wife, the perfect partner, I had been too successful. So successful that Charles had forgotten, completely and utterly, that Eleanor Ainsworth was a sentient being, a woman with her own desires, her own agency, not merely a malleable tool for his convenience. My words finally pierced his carefully constructed armor of denial. His face contorted with fury, his self-pity morphing into unadulterated rage. He roared, his voice echoing through the empty apartment. Divorce you? You'll get nothing, Eleanor. Not a penny. And the children? You won't get them either. We shall see, Charles. I replied, my voice trembling despite my best efforts at composure. I have a job now, Charles. I have my own income. I am perfectly capable of supporting my children. And Lily and Rose love their mother. They need their mother. You are welcome to test the courts, Charles. You are welcome to see which parent a judge deems more suitable. And what, exactly, do you think you can offer them, Charles? A father who wins awards, publicly thanks his colleagues, and comes home late every night smelling of perfume. My voice grew stronger, fueled by righteous anger. You won't get my daughters, Charles. Not one of them. And as for your money, keep it. Unlike you, Charles, I am not driven by cost-effectiveness. Suddenly, I remembered the day he had so casually dismissed my graduation ceremony, citing cost-effectiveness as his primary rationale. He blinked, his face registering a flicker of recognition, of dawning comprehension. He had forgotten. He had actually forgotten. You've forgotten, haven't you, Charles? I pressed on, my voice gaining strength, gaining resonance. Let me remind you. I told you then, Charles, that if I were driven by cost-effectiveness, I would never have married Charles Sterling in the first place. And the same holds true now, Charles. I didn't marry you for cost-effectiveness. And I certainly won't divorce you based on some calculated cost-benefit analysis. Eleanor Ainsworth, in her relationships, in her loves, in her hates, doesn't operate on cost-effectiveness, Charles. What I've endured these past few years with you, Charles, the most agonizing part wasn't the hardship, wasn't the exhaustion. It was your utter failure to understand me, your complete inability to value me. But no more, Charles. No more. We're done. If you're willing to concede custody of the girls, we can finalize the divorce paperwork next week. If not, I'll see you in court. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving Charles standing amidst the ruins of our marriage, offering him a final, defiant, and hopefully sufficiently shalsa, unfettered, free exit. Settling into the passenger seat of the moving truck, glancing back in the rearview mirror, watching our apartment complex, our shared life of nearly 5 years, recede into the distance, my heart trembled. I knew I had been both shalsa, unfettered, free, and in some fundamental way, utterly foolish in both my marriage and my divorce. But life, I reasoned, wouldn't be perpetually smooth sailing simply because of a few moments of shalsa, unfettered, free, resolve. Nor would it be irrevocably ruined by a few missteps, a few failures. The road ahead might be winding, uncertain, fraught with challenges, but I was Eleanor Ainsworth, and I was determined to conquer it. The best laid plans, the most carefully guarded secrets, have a way of unraveling. My impending divorce from Charles, despite my attempts at discretion, eventually reached my mother's ears. Upon learning of Charles's infidelity, her reaction was succinct, unequivocal. Good riddance, she declared, her voice devoid of any trace of sympathy or surprise. Then, unbeknownst to me, my indomitable mother launched her own offensive. She descended upon Charles's workplace, a whirlwind of maternal fury, publicly berating him, slapping him repeatedly across the face, and, for good measure, unleashing a torrent of righteous indignation upon the unfortunate Juliana Bellwether. I only learned of my mother's heroic exploits much later, from Daphne, who recounted the tale with a mixture of amusement and admiration. When I questioned my mother about her dramatic intervention, asking why she hadn't informed me beforehand, she merely rolled her eyes, dismissing my query with a wave of her hand. I wasn't doing it for your sake, Eleanor. I was doing it for my own satisfaction. Why would I need to tell you? It was undeniable. Having a mother, even a fiercely opinionated, sometimes overbearing mother was undeniably, profoundly comforting. Following my mother's intervention, Charles finally relented, agreeing to the divorce without further resistance. Not only did he relinquish custody of Lily and Rose, he also insisted on leaving me the apartment and the entirety of our savings. I didn't know his motivations, and frankly, I no longer cared. Initially, I had intended to refuse his financial offer, to walk away with nothing but my own independence. But my mother vehemently objected. "This isn't for you, Eleanor," she declared, her voice sharp with maternal authority. "This is for Lily and Rose. What right do you have to refuse what is rightfully theirs?" I conceded. My mother, as always, had a point. Ultimately, however, I only accepted the apartment, leaving the savings untouched, for Charles to keep. I wanted only what was rightfully mine, nothing more, nothing less. I had no desire to be indebted to Charles in any way. But my rejection of his money, paradoxically, seemed to deflate him, to wound his pride. "I'm Lily and Rose's father, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice subdued, almost pleading. "Everything I earn is ultimately for them. Don't be so formal with me." My response was coolly professional, devoid of any emotion. "It's not about formality, Charles. It's about boundaries. I simply prefer not to be indebted to anyone. What is rightfully mine, I will not relinquish. What is not, I will not accept. As for your money, Charles, when Lily and Rose are older, if you still wish to give it to them, that will be your prerogative as their father. It will be their decision whether to accept it. For now, simply ensure their monthly child support payments are made on time." Charles managed a bitter smile. "Do you really have to be so clinical about this, Eleanor? So determined to keep everything so separate?" I met his gaze, my expression unwavering. "We're divorced, Charles. Shouldn't things be separate now? Maintaining any ambiguity, any lingering entanglement, would be unfair to your next partner, wouldn't it?" Charles's face paled, his expression suddenly desolate. "I won't be looking for anyone else, Eleanor. There won't be a next partner." I cut him off, my voice firm, dismissive. "That's your choice, Charles. Your business. None of my concern." I signed the divorce papers without hesitation, a wave of relief washing over me. Finally, I could truly close the chapter on the past, bid farewell to Charles Sterling's wife, to the woman behind the brilliant designer. From that day forward, I would be no one's someone. I would simply be myself, Eleanor Ainsworth. Life after divorce, if I had to encapsulate it in a single word, could only be described as liberating. Lily and Rose were thriving in kindergarten, their daily school runs expertly managed by my mother. My career was steadily gaining momentum, my income gradually increasing. I hired a part-time housekeeper to handle the cleaning and prepare a simple dinner each evening. After work, I would collect Lily and Rose from my mother's, cherishing our precious mommy and daughter's time. Once they were asleep, I even found time for myself, time to read, to study, to pursue my own intellectual interests. Every weekend, Charles would pick up the girls for an overnight visit. Perhaps because Charles had been an emotionally distant presence even before the divorce, Lily and Rose quickly adapted to this new arrangement, this weekend-only father figure. I hadn't concealed the truth of our divorce from them. When they blinked their innocent eyes, asking what divorce meant, a sharp pang of sadness inevitably pierced my heart. But I explained, calmly, gently. Divorce means mommy and daddy are no longer together. But even though mommy and daddy are separate now, we both still love Lily and Rose very, very much. So, you don't need to worry, sweethearts. You won't lose anything. They nodded, their small faces serious, as if comprehending more than their tender years might suggest. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude for my education, for the professional skills I had once so carelessly considered abandoning. The opportunities one had nearly squandered now formed the bedrock of my independence, my resilience, my ability to provide for my daughters, to secure their future. They were my lifeline, my anchor in the storm. Charles, too, seemed to be cherishing his weekend time with the girls. He took them to amusement parks, zoos, botanical gardens, museums, science centers, art galleries. They went to movies, concerts, fancy restaurants. The next time, promises that had once been empty words, hollow platitudes, were now being fulfilled, one by one. Lily and Rose were thriving, radiating happiness. They declared their father had changed, had become a better daddy. Lily, with the innocent wisdom of a child, even announced, "Mommy, you and Daddy are divorced, and now Daddy is good. You should have divorced Daddy sooner." Rose, ever the emphatic echo, nodded her small head in vigorous agreement. Mommy divorced Daddy to make him better. Well, who was I to argue with such profound, if slightly misguided, toddler logic? It seemed that divorce, ironically, had finally prompted Charles to reflect on his shortcomings as a father, to confront the plasticity of his paternal efforts. If our divorce had, in some convoluted way, made him a better father to our daughters, then perhaps, in some twisted calculus of marital failure, it had been worthwhile. My only lingering source of mild annoyance was Charles himself. He seemed to harbor the persistent delusion that reconciliation, some form of renewed relationship, was still a possibility. He would send me WeChat messages, filled with belated apologies, belated acknowledgments of my sacrifices. Now that I'm parenting alone, Eleanor, I finally understand how incredibly hard it was for you. All those years. I'm so sorry, he'd write, the words hollow, meaningless, arriving years too late. Or he would send me a newly published design textbook, a thoughtful gesture of professional encouragement. I found this insightful, Eleanor. Thought you might find it inspiring. The former, his belated apologies, were utterly superfluous, landing with a dull thud in the empty space of my indifference. And the latter, I could only politely inform him. Charles, darling, I read the English version of that book months ago. Aside from these minor, almost comical, annoyances courtesy of my well-meaning but perpetually misguided ex-husband, my post-divorce life was, in its own quiet way, blossoming. I was, dare I say it, even happy, bubbling with a quiet, understated joy. So much so that, a year later, I, Eleanor Ainsworth, received the very same prestigious design award that Charles had once claimed. The rising star of the design world, once momentarily dimmed by domesticity, had finally, albeit belatedly, ascended, illuminating its rightful place in the professional firmament. In my acceptance speech, I dedicated the award to my mother, to my academic advisor, and to my true muses, my constant inspirations, my unwavering sources of love and laughter, Lily and Rose. To my surprise, and perhaps slight discomfort, Charles was present at the ceremony. He explained, with a touch of sheepishness, that he had caused me to miss my graduation ceremony years ago. He didn't want to miss this moment of triumph, this moment of well-deserved recognition. But, truth be told, his presence was utterly inconsequential, meaningless. Because, at this point, Charles, in the grand tapestry of my life, was simply an outsider, indistinguishable from any other member of the audience. 3 days after the award ceremony, I encountered Juliana Bellwether coincidentally, outside my office building. She was as impeccably dressed as ever, but her face was drawn, her expression weary, almost haunted. You must be feeling very smug now, Eleanor, she said, her voice tight with barely concealed resentment. I blinked, bewildered. Smug? I'm sorry, Juliana. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Charles missed his professional title review to attend your awards ceremony, she spat, her words laced with bitterness. And, I prompted, a dawning sense of amusement, tinged with disbelief, beginning to bubble up within me. Her face contorted with a mixture of anger and self-pity, her eyes blazing with resentment. Don't you feel even a little bit guilty, Eleanor? Your mother stormed into the institute, creating a scene, making life unbearable for both Charles and me. Then you divorced him. And now, he's jeopardizing his entire career for you, for your moment in the spotlight. And I've become a pariah. All because of you, Eleanor. My life is ruined. A genuine laugh escaped my lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated incredulity. Juliana, darling, did I seduce you? Did I force you to engage in inappropriate office flirtations with a married man? Did I hold a gun to your head and demand you become his muse, knowing full well he had a wife and children at home? Do you think I'm some kind of pushover, some spineless doormat, that you can come here and try to lay the blame at my feet? Let me remind you, Juliana, I am Li Sufin's daughter, and anything Li Sufin dares to do, I am more than capable of doing myself. Juliana burst into tears, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering. I felt a surge of weariness, of utter exasperation. I simply turned and walked away, entering the sanctuary of my office, leaving her weeping on the sidewalk, a self-made victim in her own carefully constructed drama. But her words, her accusation that Charles had jeopardized his career, missing his title review for my sake, did leave a lingering ripple in the otherwise placid waters of my post-divorce contentment. I recalled a line from a movie review about marriage, a poignant observation that echoed with an unsettling resonance. When a person finally relinquishes their lifelong expectations, the very thing they longed for unexpectedly materializes. And when a person finally learns to sacrifice themselves for another, the one they wish to dedicate themselves to has already departed. Charles and I, it seemed, had become a perfect embodiment of that tragic irony. We had finally, flawlessly, irrevocably, missed each other. The end.